Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm your host, Chris the Moose Johnson, and this is The Moose Trail. This is season 2, episode 2, and we have a very, very fun episode for you guys today. We have Will Lewin breaking down the NCAA football rankings again, and today, sadly, we're going to have no Jake. He's off doing midterms right now. Wish him luck. And then we have Kyle Sparrow with his fantasy football breakdown, and that's going to be an amazing, amazing breakdown. And then, hey, we're going to be introducing a little bit of new stuff with me and the Moose Trail Moose Stat Breakdown. That'll be more next, so we're going to send it over to Will Lewin to start it off, and this is the Moose Trail.
Thank you, Moose, and welcome everybody to the second edition of the Hot Hierarchy here on the Moose Trail. I am your host, Will Lewin, and if you missed it last week, what the Hot Hierarchy is taking the AP poll, putting my own personal flavor on it, my little zing on it, and fixing all the mistakes that they need to be fixing week in and week out. Nobody's perfect, but I am, and that's why I'm here to give out these rankings every single week. We're going to be talking about teams 11 through 25 first. Leading the charge in the AP poll is going to be the Tennessee Volunteers. They are going to be dropping 3 spots, however, even though they beat Florida, and also dropping a spot after winning their game is Notre Dame after their win against Stanford. Then we've got BYU coming up in the rankings against Arizona, Texas A&M and Indiana taking the spots of teams like Ole Miss and Utah who were in front of them. Now they fall back in the rankings. It allows these teams with bye weeks in order to move up a little bit. Boise State in between them. That win against Hawaii puts them up in the rankings. Kansas State as well with a win at Colorado. Not an easy thing to do. They come up in the rankings. They have Ole Miss after that loss against LSU. They put them right there at number 18, and Missouri just behind them as a one-loss team after they beat Massachusetts over the weekend, with Pittsburgh behind them, SMU making its way up the rankings as well as Illinois. Army and Navy seeing their first time in the AP poll this week, and Michigan staying a little stagnant after their bye week. Now to go into the Hot Hierarchy here, I too have Tennessee at number 11 as well, but instead of moving them down in the rankings, I had them at 11 last week, so they'll just be staying in the same spot. Then right behind them, I have Clemson, who finds themselves in the top 10 of the AP poll, just out of the picture for me here. Then Kansas State, after that win against Colorado, they move up for me as well. Indiana, again, taking the spots of Oklahoma, Utah in order to move up as well. And then Missouri and Pittsburgh there as well, moving up in the rankings. I have Ole Miss just above the AP poll, sitting at number 17. Just above Michigan. Again, I don't see any reason to move up Michigan or move down Michigan, so they're stagnant as well for me after that bye week. And then Army and Navy moving up in the rankings. I put them in there last week for a reason. It's hard to have Navy kind of coming into the rankings after a bye week, so for me it was important to make sure they were in there before that bye week to give them a reason to stay in there. Again, having teams coming into the rankings after a bye week just doesn't really make sense, so to have them in there the week before is definitely an important role for me. Then Texas A&M also a bye week there. LSU making its first appearance in the Hot Hierarchy for me since week 2. You'll find them in the top 10 of the AP poll. And then Arizona State making its first appearance in the Hot Hierarchy this season. Oklahoma just barely cutting it here in the top 25 of the Hot Hierarchy. We'll go into that in our On the Block segment a little more. And then UNLV right there at the bottom as well against that win against Utah State. Now as we go over to look at some of the scores, you'll kind of see the reason why some of these rankings are where they are. You've got Tennessee. Again, we talked about how they had a sketchy win. That game was very down to the wire, and they only beat a Florida, not a great Florida team, by only 6 points. Notre Dame as well. I'm very confused as to why they dropped in the rankings after that 49-7 win against Stanford. Really doesn't make sense. But again, you look over to the Hot Hierarchy, you see Clemson. They had that great win against Wake Forest. They started off a little shaky, able to find their groove in the second quarter onwards, able to get that win 49-14. And again, Indiana with a bye week, they only move up because of Ole Miss losing that game to LSU, and Utah also losing their game against Arizona State, which is exactly why we see them at 23 in the Hot Hierarchy. But you'll see that they're not located there in the AP poll. But again, moving on to Oklahoma, I will be talking about them a little more on the block. But as we move further into next week, we've definitely got some good matchups coming into the following week. Here in the AP poll, we've got Tennessee at home against Alabama, number 7 ranked. That should be a great game. We've got a little bit of cupcake games for Notre Dame and Texas A&M as they take on Georgia Tech and Mississippi State, respectively. That Oklahoma State game for BYU could cause some problems, but they are at home, so I do have faith in them. Boise State has a bye week. They're getting ready to play us, UNLV, in 2 weeks' time. After UNLV, as you can see here in the bottom of the screen, we're taking on Oregon State this week. Oregon State coming off of that loss against Nevada Reno, so they might have a little bit of a chip on their shoulder looking to bounce back. But again, looking at some of these other matchups, again, the big thing that I pointed out last week is the bye weeks. Organizing the bye weeks. You've got Boise State all the way up here. You've got Ole Miss, who just lost. They're all the way down here at 18, excuse me. And then they've got Pittsburgh as well, who also has a bye week, but they did kind of stomp on the California Parade, but now they have that bye week. The question is, okay, well, you have teams like SMU and Illinois. Illinois, that win against Michigan will be really huge. Is that enough reason to move them up against Pittsburgh when, in my eyes, Pittsburgh has been playing better football than Illinois? Same thing goes for Indiana and Kansas State. You'd like to imagine Indiana is going to come out scorching hot against Nebraska at home, so that's going to give them enough reason to pass Boise State. Kansas State at West Virginia, if they have a dominant win, does that put them up enough in the rankings against Boise State as well? That's why over here on my rankings, you can see that I've got Pitt and Ole Miss neatly organized together. Again, LSU already coming off of that win against Ole Miss. They'll be playing Arkansas next week. I'll go into a little bit more for that matchup between LSU and Ole Miss, but definitely some controversial things that I have to say about that, so make sure to stay tuned. We're going to go on the block now. First team we're going to be bringing up is none other than Illinois here. Again, they're coming off of a game against Purdue, and yes, while they may have won this game, they only win the game by 1 point, and they're at home. We know how dominant Purdue is when they're the ones at home, but this time they're on the road, so it's not really that shocking that Purdue not only lose this game, but give up 50 points. Ultimately, Illinois, 24-point favorites in this game. They only win the game by 1, and they're already coming off of that loss against Penn State. While it may not be the worst loss in the AP poll, it's still a loss against a pretty good Penn State team that now sees themselves number 3 ranked in the country. So it will take a little more for Illinois for me to rank them in my personal hot hierarchy systems. But as we move on to the next team on the block, it's going to be Oklahoma. So here's the thing with Oklahoma. They do have these unfortunate losses against dominant teams like Texas and like Tennessee in the last 3 games alone. They do have that win against Alabama, but the thing that I really want to focus on is the reason why Oklahoma have been losing all of these games is because they have no wide receivers. They have no offense. It's been their defense doing all the work, and you can see the defense doing all the work here, slowing down a dominant Texas team to only 34 points. The same thing with Tennessee, only 25 points for them. Again, it's been good showings for the Oklahoma defense, but with no weapons on offense, they're just not putting any points up on the board. So while, yes, it is a very unfortunate circumstance for Oklahoma, the AP poll simply has no remorse for this team whatsoever, whereas I have them just on the cusp. I feel like they still can make a difference. They've got a couple games coming up these next few weeks that, they might be able to sneak a win or 2 out of there, and they might still go higher up in the rankings. But out of the AP poll, it's going to be very hard for them to get back in. Moving on to the next team out of the ACC, it's going to be the SMU Mustangs. They're coming off of that great win against Louisville, and they do find themselves in the AP poll. But the reason why I don't have them in my AP poll is because they just need one more win. They've got this game at Stanford coming up, and that could be the one that does it for me. Playing at the Farm is no easy thing to do, and SMU is looking to go into the Farm, beat them by maybe 10, 20 points. They'll certainly be making an appearance in the hot hierarchy next week. Moving on to the next team on the block, of course, it's going to be Boise State. Again, still not in my rankings, and that is solely because of this performance that they had against Hawaii. Just nothing to really show for it. We see that they scored 62 against Utah State. They scored 45 against Washington State, but to go to Hawaii and only score 28, it's definitely questionable. The Heisman leader right now, Ashton Jeanty, still having a dominant performance with a ton of rushing yards and a touchdown on the game, but only 28 points. I understand the 3-hour difference in order to make it to Hawaii, but you got to prepare yourselves for that. They are looking into a bye week right now, so they'll be able to get some rest and prepare themselves for arguably their biggest game of the season, which will be at UNLV at Allegiant Stadium in 2 weeks' time. Now moving on to the last team here on the block, it's going to be the Arizona State Sun Devils. Again, they find themselves on my hot hierarchy rankings, not in the AP poll. But again, the main reason why they're on here, just look at this dominant win against Utah. They beat them 27-19 at home. Utah ranked 16th in the nation. And you're telling me they don't deserve a spot? They did get some votes from the AP poll, but again, they had to prioritize undefeated teams like Navy and like Army. So they see themselves in the rankings, whereas they should have been in last week, like I mentioned in week 1 of the Moose Trail. Now they find themselves just on the brink, now on the outside, looking in. They've got a win against Kansas, which isn't necessarily the biggest deal in the world. We've seen teams like UNLV, who's also not that dominant in terms of Big 12, that have been able to get that win against Kansas, as well as other teams. And we look at that loss against Texas Tech. The reason why it doesn't really stand out to me is just because of the hodgepodge that the Big 12 is right now. Yes, you have Texas Tech beating Arizona State, but you have teams like Arizona and Utah beating Texas Tech as well. But then again, on the flip side, you have teams like Arizona State beating Utah. So it's just one continuous cycle, just teams beating other teams. The Big 12, definitely, this is one of the big things that have really been the downfall of this conference realignment, is that you just have so many good teams. It's hard to really find the true rankings of a lot of these programs. But just a quick look at on the block before we move on to the top 10. Again, Illinois, Oklahoma, SMU, Boise State, Arizona State. I would like to see Arizona State in the rankings next week, and then depending on how SMU plays against the Stanford Cardinal this weekend will truly determine how far I put them up in the hot hierarchy once they make it into the hot hierarchy. And then again, also important to look out for teams like Oklahoma and like Illinois, who haven't had the greatest of seasons so far, but still have great teams nonetheless. Now we're going to get into it here, folks. It's going to be the top 10 of the AP poll. Leading the charge, like every other week, it's going to be the Texas Longhorns, of course. Again, they're coming off of that Red River rivalry win. And then you've got Oregon beating Ohio State at Autzen Stadium. Dan Lanning, the coach of the Ducks, with just some impeccable coaching, finding loopholes in the rules in order to win his team the game late in Eugene, Oregon that night. Penn State with a great win against USC sees themselves move up in the rankings, and Ohio State only at 4 now. They are a 5-1 team. That means Ohio State is the highest ranked one-loss team in the nation right now. But to be fair, they lost to a very good team. So seeing this doesn't really shock me. Will we see it on the hot hierarchy? We'll get into it soon. But really quick, just talking about Georgia, they had a win against Mississippi State. They don't move. Miami and Alabama don't move. Miami makes sense. They have a bye week. They're not doing anything all week. But Alabama win against South Carolina. They don't move. It was a close game. Still not moving. LSU, great win against Ole Miss, but they find themselves number 8. If you remember back to the hot hierarchy, I barely have them coming back into the rankings. We'll get into that just right now as we talk over the hot hierarchy rankings. At number 1 is going to be the Oregon Ducks, of course. Oregon with a dominant win over Ohio State, and I mean dominant. Yes, they won by 1 point, but when you go back and look at all the missed opportunities from Oregon, they could have easily won this game by 15 or more points. So if you were to take that into consideration, and if the AP poll really took it into consideration, they would definitely be the number 1 ranked team in the nation, in my opinion. Then we've got Texas just under them. The reason why I had Penn State here last week at number 3 was because that win against USC was going to be very sketchy. I did say last week that it would be a very good game, and we might even see an upset from USC. They almost got the job done, but not quite. So now with that win, it's still a good win, but it doesn't have any reason to move them up in the rankings. We see them moving up in the AP poll, but not in the hot hierarchy. That's why they were there at number 3. Everything happens for a reason here on the hot hierarchy. And then Georgia finds itself as a 4 team. In my eyes, they are the best one-loss team until proven otherwise. And then Ohio State's going to drop to 5 for me. I've got Notre Dame in my top 10 as a 5-1 team. Again, they suffered that brutal loss against NIU earlier on in the season. But again, everybody makes mistakes. Every college football program has that week, and unfortunately, it just happened to Notre Dame. But again, with that great win against Stanford over the weekend, it really shows that Notre Dame has really come over that hump. They've come a long way as a program and as a team. I see good things for Notre Dame in the future and certainly should be making the 12-team playoff later this season. Then I've got Miami and Alabama remaining stagnant like in the AP poll. Again, Alabama not with a great win. As we take a look at some of the scores here, you'll see that, again, it's a very close 27-25 win against South Carolina. And keep in mind that Alabama was at home for this game. Also to note that I have BYU in the hot hierarchy as well. Just a great win against Arizona. Arizona has certainly been the underdog multiple times this season, not to mention that they were ranked at one point. Iowa State in the 9th spot as well. They'll be moving up a spot. Me and the AP poll, we definitely agree with Iowa State and the dominant performances they've been having in the Big 12. But it's really important to look on to next week. And I feel like this is where the AP poll really kind of messed it all up. We've got Georgia at Texas, Miami at Louisville, Alabama at Tennessee, and LSU at Arkansas. I'm going to say it now. All 4 of these teams will lose. Georgia will lose to Texas, Miami will lose to Louisville, Alabama will lose to Tennessee, and LSU will lose to Arkansas. So you have 4 teams in the top 10 that are all clumped together that are now all potentially going to lose next week. Where do you put them in the AP poll? Some of them will be 2-loss teams. You'll have Alabama and LSU, which will be a 2-loss team, as well as Georgia being a 2-loss team. So the question is, where do you put these teams in the AP poll? You know that they can't just all be clumped together and move as one unit throughout the rankings, because there will be losses that are worse than others and wins that are better than others. So that is one of the big problems at the AP poll, is that instead of taking into consideration the teams that these programs are playing, they're just looking at the programs and how dominant they've been. That's great. That's cool and all. But look at who they're playing. Look at how they're playing against the teams that they need to be playing good against, the teams that they need to be playing a close ball game against. Definitely a lot of factors. Whereas if you look over to the hot hierarchy, it's a lot more organized. You've got Georgia in the midst of Ohio State and Penn State, who are now going to be entering bye weeks, right? I already said that Georgia's going to be losing that game against Texas, which means that Ohio State naturally moves up in the rankings. They're in the same conference as Penn State. They might be going up against one another later on in the season. So we'll see at least one of those teams be better than the other. It's just a question of when that's going to happen. And you'll have Georgia drop out of the top 10. Again, Notre Dame is having an easy schedule right now playing Georgia Tech. You've got Miami and Alabama, who I already said are going to lose those games, so they'll be both out of the rankings. And it allows for teams like an undefeated BYU, an undefeated Iowa State, not to mention an undefeated Indiana as well, to naturally make their way up the rankings as well. They're not being given enough credit for winning these games and being undefeated. It's not an easy thing to do, to go into certain areas of the nation and play these away games, knowing that there's going to be a huge target on your back with that giant goose egg over the 6 that's next to your win column. That's the biggest thing for these undefeated teams, and why it's not easy for them week in and week out. So to move all of these teams together would be a huge mistake for the AP poll, but yet here we are ranking them all together. A nice little group of 4 altogether, and I do believe that all 4 of them will lose this weekend. But that's for time to tell, and as for time, that's going to do it for me here on the Hot Hierarchy. Thanks for tuning in.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another week of Sparrow's Sensational Fantasy Breakdown. I'm your host, Kyle Sparrow, and this week we're going to be looking at some people that kind of broke out of their shell and did really well in fantasy this week. Starting off, we have Justin Fields. He became the number 6 fantasy quarterback after week 6, and he had an impressive performance. He had 23.7 points in week 6. He's projected 17.8 points for week 7 against the New York Jets. He threw for 145 yards and rushed for 11 attempts, but this is where he got those 23.7 fantasy points with those 2 rushing touchdowns. Now watch out. I don't have a sit him or start him on this because Russell Wilson has been activated via that knee injury. So look out in the next coming weeks to see if Justin Fields gets demoted to the backup quarterback position. But Justin Fields has been doing a really good job. He has led the Steelers to a 4-2 record. So I think he's on the come up. Moving on, we have Caleb Williams, who had another impressive performance against Jacksonville. He's the number 11 fantasy quarterback after week 6. And as I said before, against Jacksonville, 28.64 fantasy points. Next week, he has a bye. Going into that bye, he's got a lot of momentum. The past 2 weeks, he's put up amazing numbers. He threw for 226 yards and 4 touchdowns, and he rushed for 4 attempts and 56 yards. I have him as a stardom because he is a rookie. We're starting to see the Caleb Williams that was expected, and I think we will continue to see that. So definitely start him for week 8. Moving on, we have Jordan Love. Now the Green Bay Packers are trending up. He's the number 18 fantasy ranked quarterback after this week 6. 25.62 fantasy points against the Arizona Cardinals. He's projected 16.7 points. So he had a boom last week. I'm expecting a boom the next week. They're playing a tough Houston defense, but with the way Jordan Love's been throwing the ball, I think you can expect a lot more. He threw for 258 yards and again, 4 touchdowns. Rushed for only 13 yards off 5 attempts, but those 4 touchdowns and those 258 yards contributed massively to those 26.62 points. I have him as a stardom. I think he's on the rise. He's starting to gain the recognition he deserves, and his receivers are also showing out for him. Next, we have Allen Lazard, who played Monday Night Football against the Buffalo Bills. He became the number 11 fantasy-ranked wide receiver after Week 6. 23.4 points against Buffalo in Week 6, and a big part of that was that Hail Mary that I'm sure we all saw going into the half at the end of the second quarter, and a lot of that was contributed to those 23.4 fantasy points. 114 yards receiving, and obviously that 1 touchdown. He also had a beautiful throw from Aaron Rodgers that fit in a tight window. He's projected 7.8 points against Pittsburgh. And be on the lookout. Davante Adams just traded today again to the Jets. So he is now the wide receiver 3 behind Garrett Wilson and Davante Adams. So I'm saying sit him because I don't think he's going to get as many reps. As well as if he didn't have that Hail Mary touchdown, a lot of those points would be off the board. Moving on, we have Evan Ingram. He's been injured for the past 3 to 4 weeks. Number 41 ranked fantasy tight end after Week 6. He did have 18.2 points coming out of this week against Chicago. He's only projected 12 points in Week 7, but fantasy managers can finally rejoice because he is back from injury, and he put up a pretty good showing. 102 yards for 10 receptions. I say him as a stardom. I think Trevor Lawrence is now starting to manage his tight ends and manage his receivers a little bit better. Obviously, you have Brian Thomas, and Evan Ingram's going to be sliding into that, I think, receiver 2 spot. So I say start him. Moving on, we have Terry McLaurin. I mean, I said this last week. I think Jaden Daniels has done a fantastic job with this Commanders offense. Number 12, fantasy ranked wide receiver after Week 6, 23.3 points. It's clear that he is Jaden Daniels, number 1 target, as he had 6 receptions for 53 yards, yes, but in the red zone, 2 touchdowns in Week 6, and the Commanders are on fire. Yes, they lost to Baltimore. They're 4-2, and Jaden Daniels looks to be Offensive Rookie of the Year candidate. I say start him. Obviously, you have Jaden Daniels at the helm. It's pretty obvious he's the wide receiver 1 in Washington. Next, we have Chris Godwin, who had an insane performance for the Buccaneers. That put him up to number 1 fantasy ranked wide receiver after Week 6. 35.5 points against New Orleans. He's only projected 18.7 points Week 7 against Baltimore. But he had 129 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns against New Orleans. Baker Mayfield, he has Mike Evans. I think Chris Godwin slides right into that wide receiver 2 spot, and he went nuclear this week. And you can expect him to try to sort of get the recognition and kind of challenge Chris Evans for wide receiver 1. Not quite. He had a really good week, though, which propelled him into that number 1 fantasy spot. Next, speaking of Tampa Bay Buccaneers, we have Baker Mayfield, who had an also really good showing this week against the New Orleans Saints. Number 2 fantasy ranked quarterback. He went up a lot. He's only projected 19.3 points against Baltimore. And that Baltimore defense is very, very tough. But in that game against New Orleans, he had 325 yards passing and 4 touchdowns. Only rushed for 29 yards, but 4 touchdowns. That's 24 points right off the board. And he's averaging 22.5 points per game. He's a stardom for me. I think that he has been one of the most consistent fantasy starts quarterback-wise and in general. Moving on, we have George Kittle, who had a masterful game against the Seattle Seahawks. Because of that, he is the number 1 ranked fantasy tight end after that game. 22.8 to show for it. Against Seattle, he's only projected 13.8. Again, I think he's going to boom against Kansas City. Big game. Tight ends are utilized on both sides of the ball there. Only had 58 yards, 5 receptions for 58 yards, but he had 2 touchdowns. Again, 14 points right there. And he's a saving grace for the 49ers. It's George Kittle. He's always good. I say start him. He's always a good fantasy tight end. And moving on, we have Joe Mixon. Don't let the number fool you. Number 29 fantasy ranked running back after week 6. Yes, he was injured. 27.2 points against New England in week 6. He's only projected 15.6 points against Green Bay, but he had 102 yards rushing and 1 touchdown. He is now, because of Nico Collins being injured, you still have Tank Dell and Stephon Diggs and a couple other receivers, but because Joe Mixon is back, CJ Stroud's going to look to distribute the ball more. I say start him because Joe Mixon is just that good. And moving on, finally, we have Bijan Robinson. I think a lot of fantasy managers liked what he did against Carolina. Because of that, he was the number 7th overall running back in fantasy after week 6. 25.5 points against Carolina. He's projected 20 points against Seattle. 95 yards, again, 2 touchdowns. Don't be hasty to bench him because of that 10.2 performance, I think, 1 or 2 weeks ago. But I think he's a start him. I think Kirk Cousins is having a good season passing, but he's going to start to distribute the ball to Bijan Robinson, who's also an elusive running back out of the backfield. And that's all we have for today. I'm Kyle Sparrow, and thank you for watching this segment of Sparrow's Sensational Fantasy Breakdown. We'll see y'all next week.
Thank you so much, Kyle, for being an amazing breakdown for the fantasy football fans out there. And I can't wait to see if you're going to be right. I want to use a few more of my guys. I got a few trades coming in. I got Garrett Wilson and Terry McLaurin coming up. So we'll see if they can do something for me. But hey, let's get right into our breakdown because we need to do that. And I have some predictions that I made last week. We got to see if I'm right. We got to see if I'm wrong. But first, let's get into the real breakdowns, and then we'll talk about what's going to happen later with our possible breakdowns. So, Eagles, they beat the Browns, but didn't look convincing. A.J. Brown came back, had an amazing game. That's why the Eagles needed him. The Giants battle with the Bengals. Great game by the Giants. I can't wait to see what they're going to do this week against the Eagles. Saquon Barkley revenge comeback game. Maybe the Giants say, hey, we didn't need him that much. We have Tyrone Tracy Jr. Shout out to my friend James. Cowboys, they lost to the Lions very bad. I believe it was 47-9. Hey, the Cowboys are probably going to be the worst in this division, and that's hard to say, but I think the Giants are going to be a better team at the end of the year. And Commanders, you're a great team. Don't lose sight of that. You lost to the best team in football, and that's the Baltimore Ravens, and they have been amazing this year, so you can't even be mad at what they did. Next, we have the NFC North, the best division in football. Yes, and I believe possibly we might see every single one of these teams make it to the playoffs. That's right. We might see a 4-team playoff situation in the NFC North, and that would be very crazy. The division winner and then the 3 wild card spots. It's going to be hard for a lot of teams to keep up with these 4-2, 4-2, 5-0, and 4-1 teams in this division. They're playing lights out, and I don't see them stopping anytime soon. Next, we have the AFC West. Man, Raiders, I really had some faith in you this weekend. You would have kept me perfect with my predictions, but I knew the Steelers had a chance of beating them. Their defense just had a struggle game. Aiden O'Connell's first game in. The Steelers are a really good, really well-coached team, and they travel well. And the Raiders just didn't have a good, convincing game that game. It happens. Raiders lose. Chiefs bye week, and then a division game between the Chargers and Broncos, and the Chargers came out on top like I thought they would. Jim Harbaugh is a really good coach. He doesn't have a rookie quarterback. Sean Payton does, and that ended up making the difference between the two. Next, we have the Jets, who just traded for Devontae Adams. But I'm going to say something that's going to be a little out of the regular loop of everybody else. I don't think he's going to change the trajectory of the Jets this year. I think the Jets defense is going to be too bad for them to really come back from. Yes, they have a high-ranking defense, but they just got ran all over. That's what happened to the Cowboys last year when they found out, hey, with the Cardinals, we can run all over this team, and they're not going to be able to do anything about it. So I don't know if the Jets are going to be able to come back from that. We'll see. Devontae Adams is a great move nonetheless, and we'll see if Aaron Rodgers can get back to his prime form. But the more dangerous trade that happened that day was Amari Cooper to the Bills, and I really think Amari Cooper is going to change a lot of that Bills offense. Josh Allen loves his receivers and can go up and get it. Amari Cooper's a great receiver. He just hasn't been in the right situation yet. And now he finally lands himself in Buffalo with an elite quarterback and an elite situation and an elite offense. We'll see what's going to happen with them, and I can't wait to see what the Bills are going to do with the rest of the year. I think they have a chance of pushing deep in the playoffs. Next, we have the AFC South. That is led by the Texans, and it's going to be the Texans that come out of this division. That is the only team that I see that's going to do anything. The Colts, Joe Flacco is Joe Flacco. Anthony Richardson is Anthony Richardson. They're going to kind of figure themselves out. I don't see them really pushing for the playoffs. I see the Texans just taking the division and moving on. We don't really need to talk about them too much. Nico Collins will come back at some point, and he will make an amazing difference for the rest of the year. Now, the moment we've all been waiting for. The man versus machine segment. That is right. We're in a deadlock, by the way, me and my stat, with 22-6 as our prediction record for the last 2 weeks in the NFL. The Moose stat is a grouping of stats that are the most important to NFL teams to win games. And then, of course, me and my elite ball knowledge are going to be making predictions this year on what's going to happen. We'll see who wins. Man versus machine. I made a really good stat. I feel like it's doing pretty well, as you can see, with 22-6. And I'm also 22-6. So we'll see what we can do. Pretty good winning record. Let's see who did it better this weekend. And let's go off with not mine, the Moose stats predictions this weekend. Yeah, it only missed 2 games. It predicted the Giants were going to beat the Bengals, which I didn't see that happening, but it did. And it said that the Jets were going to beat the Bills. I didn't see that happening either, but it did predict at least the one that I got wrong, and that is the Steelers versus the Raiders. It got the Steelers. I chose the Raiders. I think it's probably because of my little bias at being home, but hey, it happens. It's called we live in Las Vegas, and I want to see the Raiders do good. But at the same time, they couldn't pull out a win, and you're going to see my predictions with next week change it up. As you can see, my predictions from last week were those. Now, let's get into the Moose Stats predictions for the next week's winners table. That's what it looks like right now. And I'm going to tell you right now, there's a few teams that I disagree with being on there, and we're going to see in that next little bit right here, and that is this little group. I like the Broncos. I like the Chiefs. I like the Chargers. I like the Rams over this, and we're going to see what happens. I'm going to break down a little bit more of all the teams as we go on, but hey, here we go. Now, we have Thursday Night Football. Here's my prediction first. I'm going to let you guys know. I'm going first. Machine goes second. That's how we're going to roll this. So first is me. I think the Broncos are going to be the Saints pretty convincingly. It's Sean Payton and Bo Nix need a bounce-back game. They're going against a rookie quarterback and Spencer Rattler. That team's banged up, and I don't think the Saints are going to be able to pull it off. But guess what? The Moose stat doesn't know situational storylines, like Spencer Rattler being the quarterback now and not Derek Carr, and it being a rookie, not a vet. So it chose the Saints on Thursday Night Football. This is a thing that me and the Moose stat disagree on. I think the Texans are going to win this weekend. I think C.J. Stroud and his team are very dangerous, and they're not going to lose a lot of games this year at all. Joe Mixon's back. Even though they don't have Nico Collins, they still have Joe Mixon, and I think the Packers aren't ready for it. They're still young, and the receiving corps just can't stay healthy. I don't know who's going to be starting this weekend for them. It could be Christian Watson. It could be Romeo Doubs. It could be the full roster. It also could be only 2 of them. It literally happened about a week or 2 ago where Romeo Doubs got suspended for a game on a Thursday. So we'll see what happens with them. But I think the Texans came up with that game, and I don't think the Packers really have a chance there. But the Moose stat disagrees with me. The Moose stat says the Packers will win on Sunday. Here comes a big disagreement. I believe Saquon Barkley is about to run for 200 yards and 2 touchdowns, and I'm pretty confident in saying that. I don't think the Giants really have a chance this weekend, but the Eagles have not been playing well, and the Moose stat disagrees. It says the Giants are going to be winning this game, and I could see that happening. The Giants have a really good defense. They have a really strong running game in Tyrone Tracy. The Eagles' defense has been struggling here and there, and if the offense can't get it clicking early, the Giants might be up early. But hey, Danny Dimes is the key factor. I don't know if he could play well or not, and we'll see what happens between those two. We both agree on the Moose stat and I that the Raiders are going to be losing to the Rams. And look, It's no shade to the Raiders or the Raider fans. The Rams are at home. The Raiders are just struggling this year. They just traded Davante Adams. I mean, I don't see them really doing too hot for the next few weeks. I thought they should have gotten Hassan Reddick in that Davante Adams trade. I really do. I thought they should have gotten exactly what they got for Davante and then got Hassan Reddick, because what's the loss for the Jets there? Nothing. You're getting Davante Adams at the end of the day, and still Hassan Reddick is not going to sign a contract to play with you. So you might as well just put him on the Raiders, and that would have solved a lot of problems, especially with losing Christian Wilkins this year and Malcolm Kuntz on the D-line. So I disagree with the trade, but hey, it is what it is. We'll see what the Raiders do this year. I think this is going to be possibly a struggle year, but they get their quarterback in the draft and they turn around next year. This team's close. They're close. They're just a quarterback away, literally, and it could be Aiden O'Connell that leads the way. So we'll see what happens this weekend with them. And next is a really good game. But hey, it's Andy Reid in a bye week. I think Andy Reid's going to stomp on the Niners. Yes, I do. The Niners, they could get their revenge this weekend, but I don't think it's going to happen. I think the Chiefs are ready to go. They're coming off of a bye week. They've been struggling in the beginning of the year. They're not really playing like the Chiefs normally do, but hey, this defense can really win them some games. And Patrick Mahomes, it's Patrick Mahomes. But the Moose Stat disagrees. It says the San Francisco 49ers are playing way better football right now, and they believe that it's going to be a complete Niners win against the Chiefs. Hopefully that does happen for some of my friends' sake, as they are Niner fans. This is another disagreement between me and the Moose Stat. I think the Chargers are going to win. The Chargers have Jim Harbaugh. They have Justin Herbert. They have a good offense. They have a good defense. The Cardinals, they just lost Marvin Harrison Jr. to a concussion last week. He could be fine, but it's a concussion. It's a little scary to see players come back from that. I don't really want to see him come back a week later. I'd like it to be 2 weeks later. So I think the Chargers are going to end up winning, as the Cardinals will be expressing caution with their super high-end pick of a receiver. But the Moose Stat disagrees, and it says the Cardinals will win that game, as the Cardinals have been doing decent against teams that they go against, and the Chargers' really bad pass offense is starting to kind of creep up on them. But I think they're going to turn it around this year, and that's what's going on with them. But that will be all for all of our predictions this week. I am your host, Chris the Moose Johnson. Thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you to Kyle for coming in and giving us a fantasy breakdown. Thank you to Will for going in and giving us an amazing college football scene breakdown. And hopefully we'll see some of these NFL prospects really shine this weekend with college ball. I'm Chris the Moose Johnson again. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you guys next week.